Have you ever noticed how reality seems to change shape before your eyes, as if each perception opened a different crack in the same scene? An object that was once ordinary, under another kind of attention, becomes mysterious. A memory that seemed immutable, under new light, takes on another flavor. It's as if the simple act of observing reorganized the world. Quantum physics already whispers this to us. The observer is not outside the phenomenon, but within it. The electron that chooses to be wave or particle does not do so alone. It responds to the presence of the one who looks. Consciousness, in this sense, is not just a witness to the universe, but a co-author. With every gesture of attention, something is written in the invisible fabric of existence. And it's not only science. In the oldest spiritual traditions, the gaze is always invoked as a creative power. The oracle did not describe the future because he knew it, but because he brought it into being by uttering it. The shaman did not contemplate fire merely to warm the body, but because fire, under his gaze, responded with language and direction. To observe has always been to create. Now think, if everything you look at reorganizes itself, what happens when you look at yourself? Not a distracted look, but the one that crosses the surface and touches the depths. What changes then? The body? The mind? Or the very field of possibilities you inhabit? This is the starting point. Consciousness does not merely watch the spectacle of life. It is the invisible hand that writes the script while you breathe. And with every choice of focus, an entire universe repositions itself before you. Did you think you were simply walking inside a landscape? Perhaps it is the landscape that walks inside your gaze. Have you noticed that even dreams obey the gaze that contemplates them? A fleeting dream dissolves in the morning because we give it no attention, while another lingers, almost tangible, because we faced it with curiosity. This logic is not limited to the nocturnal world. Waking life works the same way. Wherever you fix consciousness, the world thickens. Wherever you divert it, it empties. Modern science began to perceive this through experiments that seemed paradoxical. The famous double slit, for example, revealed that subatomic particles can behave like diffuse waves or defined points. What determines their form is not a rigid law of nature, but the fact of being observed. In other words, the act of looking changes the result. We are not dealing with a technical detail, but with a key that changes our relationship with the real. From a spiritual perspective, this idea was never new. Ancient masters affirmed that attention is the food of existence. Wherever focus is placed, vitality grows. Wherever the gaze is withdrawn, the world dissolves into dust. This vision may sound mystical, but it's enough to remember that even biology confirms the same principle. Cells multiply according to signals they receive. Ecosystems flourish or collapse depending on the presence or absence of human care. Everything responds to the contact of consciousness. We can understand this mechanism as a vibrational field. Each thought, each act of observing, sends out a wave that reorganizes invisible patterns. We are not just decoding the world as passive readers. We are emitting frequencies that shape the very text we believe we are reading. It's as if the universe were a manuscript in constant revision, and the human gaze worked like living ink, redrawing entire paragraphs. This perception provokes an important rupture. Perhaps the world we believe to be given is less solid than we think. Perhaps it is malleable, sensitive, almost liquid before consciousness. This does not mean we can manipulate everything with the mind in a simplistic way, but rather that each act of observing activates potential paths that were previously suspended. To better understand, think of a song that has not yet been played. It exists in potential within the strings of an instrument, but it does not take form until someone decides to play it. Reality behaves in a similar way. The quantum field is like that instrument. It contains infinite possible melodies. The observer is the one who chooses the first note, and by playing it, influences the entire sequence to come. Psychology also points in this direction. Studies on mindfulness reveal that what we choose to focus on determines not only the mood of the day, but also the structure of the brain in the long term. Neuroplasticity shows that each choice of gaze literally sculpts neural connections. What was once only mystical hypothesis today has scientific basis. consciousness shapes both subjective experience and material biology. However, the essential point is not only in academic confirmation, but in existential impact. What does it mean to live knowing that the gaze not only interprets but also creates? It means that no encounter is neutral. It means that every relationship, every memory, every future is open to the interference of the consciousness that observes it. And this is where the responsibility of the observer arises. If every gaze is a creative force, then every distraction is also an act of creation. The world we see as chaotic may be reflecting the dispersion of our attention. Likewise, an aligned life, full of meaning, can emerge from the decision to sustain the gaze in deeper directions. The power to rewrite reality, therefore, does not lie in altering external laws, but in understanding that the stage reorganizes itself according to inner presence. Looking is not just seeing, it is interacting, choosing, vibrating, activating possibilities. Consciousness acts like an invisible brush that colors what once seemed only neutral and gray. And then an inevitable question arises. If the gaze truly shapes, to what extent is what we call external reality actually a reflection of how we look? Perhaps we are living inside a moving mirror, not in the physical sense, but as a living metaphor that everything responds to contact with attention. This key, called the power of the observer, is not a distant theory. It is happening now, while you listen to these words. Your very listening already modifies the field where the message is inscribed. You are not just a passive receiver of what is being said. You are a co-author of this moment. The universe, after all, has never been ready and finished. It remains in gestation, awaiting the gaze that updates it. And each time you decide to observe with presence, you not only read the world, you write it anew. If in physics and psychology it is already revealed that the observer alters what he touches with his gaze, in everyday experience this power manifests itself even more intimately. Think of how a familiar landscape changes color according to the inner state. The same sunset can be melancholy or ecstasy, depending on who contemplates it. The sun did not change, the clouds did not move differently. What changed was the gaze. And it is at this point that we perceive the invisible thread that unites consciousness and reality. To broaden this understanding, it is necessary to introduce an unprecedented metaphor: consciousness as a sculptor of air. Imagine a room full of suspended dust. Each beam of light entering through the window reveals particles that were previously invisible. The air was always there, but only became visible because something crossed it. The gaze works in this way. It does not create from nothing, but gives shape to what was in suspension. Each attention cast is like a hand shaping luminous dust into figures once unthinkable. This image is not only poetic, it is practical. Try closing your eyes and directing focus to a simple thought, such as any word. As you sustain that word, you will see that other images connect to it, that memories and sensations begin to organize themselves around it. The thought, once dispersed, takes form because you fed it with the gaze of the mind. Now transfer this to a larger situation, a life project, a relationship, a spiritual path. The form they take depends on how much your consciousness sustains them. It is like a small flame. If you only glance at it, it goes out with the breeze. But if you decide to protect and nurture it, it becomes a bonfire. Consciousness acts as guardian of this invisible fire. Nothing flourishes outside of attention. There is yet a deeper symbolic layer, the myth of the goddess who weaves. In different cultures, she appears with different names, always associated with the thread of destiny. It is not a fixed destiny, but a living loom that responds to touch. The thread is not ready. It vibrates according to the hand that moves it. Consciousness is this weaver, and reality is the fabric that changes under its invisible gesture. This metaphor also reveals the danger of distraction. If the gaze is the loom, dispersion is the abandoned loom. Threads tangle, patterns become confused, and life presents itself as chaos. But this chaos is not an enemy. It is merely the fabric awaiting new attention. Each knot, each confusion, can be remade. Practically, this means that we do not need to wait for external changes to perceive transformation. It is enough to reposition the gaze. When a problem seems unbearable, the instinct is to fight against it or flee. But if the observer decides to sustain focus in another way, the problem begins to reorganize itself. What seemed solid reveals nuances, hidden spaces, cracks for creation. Not because the difficulty ceased to exist, but because consciousness altered the frame in which it was contained. This practice can be trained. Close your eyes for a few seconds and visualize before you a surface of calm water. Now notice that your breathing creates waves in that water. With each inhale, the liquid mirror moves. With each exhale, it returns to balance. This image is more than imagination. It translates how consciousness interacts with the world. Your gaze is the invisible breath that moves the surface of reality. And with each movement, the reflected landscape changes. The sky, the trees, the faces, everything reorganizes itself according to the waves you produce. The world then ceases to be a fixed painting and becomes a living lake, constantly responding to the presence of the observer. This exercise shows that consciousness is not an immovable point, but a flow that draws what it sees. The world is dynamic, not because time passes, but because the gaze rewrites it incessantly. It is like walking down a corridor of doors that only open when someone approaches. With each step of attention, doors unlock, revealing scenarios that were invisible. But an inevitable question arises. If each gaze creates, is there truly a world independent of observation? Or is everything we call real merely the accumulated result of infinite intertwined gazes? This doubt does not weaken the mystery. On the contrary, it deepens it. What we can affirm is that whether on a quantum, psychological, or spiritual scale, consciousness possesses this capacity to shape. And in recognizing this, something awakens within the observer. The certainty that we are not merely inhabiting the world, but also giving it form, like invisible sculptors shaping the air with the simple act of sustaining the gaze. Up to this point, everything seems to suggest that the gaze is a key that opens hidden landscapes, as if it were enough to sustain attention for the world to organize itself into new forms. But there is something more unsettling. What if consciousness not only shapes reality, but actually creates it in the very act of observing? This possibility breaks with common sense. We were always taught that the world is already ready, solid, existing apart from us, and that our role is merely to perceive it. But the evidence, both from physics and from spiritual experience, points in the opposite direction. Until now, you believed you were seeing the universe. But what if it is the universe that manifests only because you look? This paradox echoes in mystical traditions. Without the observer, nothing exists. Not as a metaphor, but literally. A tree that falls in a forest without a witness is not merely silence. It may never have existed as an event. Sound, form, vibration, everything arises in relation to the gaze. The real is not a thing in itself. It is an encounter. This pattern break may seem uncomfortable, almost threatening. After all, who would we be in a world that depends on our gaze to exist? The answer is dizzying, not merely part of the scenery, but co-authors of the scene. A symbolic example helps support this shift. The story of a painter who spends his life trying to portray the perfect landscape. He paints mountains, rivers, skies, and is never satisfied. Until one day, resting before the blank canvas, he realizes that the landscape arises as he faces it. It is not the brush that creates, it is the gaze that decides. The canvas only becomes a mountain because he sees it as such. In that instant, the painter understands that the entire world has always been a living canvas, waiting for his gaze to configure it. This story echoes in us, because deep down we know that something similar happens in our lives. Projects that seemed impossible became reality simply because someone sustained attention on them. Relationships were born not because they were written in stone, but because a gaze recognized them and gave them body. The universe is not stone. It is canvas. But this creative power also reveals its more demanding face. If the gaze invents realities, we can no longer hide behind the excuse that things are the way they are. No, things are the way they are seen. Chaos, emptiness, fullness. Everything depends on the consciousness that sustains them. This is the great shift, discovering that we are not victims of the scenery, but painters of the canvas. And here lies the fascinating contradiction. The more we believe the world is external and fixed, the more we feel imprisoned by it. The more we recognize that the world is woven by the gaze, the freer we become to recreate. It is a paradox that, instead of diminishing the real, expands it. Because the universe is not something finished before us, but a field of possibilities in perpetual birth. This understanding calls for courage. It requires admitting that we cannot blame the scenery for what we live, but must look within and recognize how our consciousness painted it that way. And at the same time, it brings relief. If we were able to paint a dense picture, we are also able to paint another, more luminous one. The brush was never taken from us. Now, in the face of this shift, I want to invite you to a simple action that reinforces this creative power. If each gaze reorganizes the real, the act of writing is also a gesture of creation. So, like this video, as a way to sustain presence in this theme, and write in the comments the phrase, "I am the observer who creates," not as an automatic repetition, but as a conscious choice. In doing so, you will not only be interacting with words, but inscribing in the collective field a vibrational declaration. The world is not a given. It is born from the gaze that sustains it. The shift that reveals the observer as creator opens an even deeper question: how to live in the face of this power, not as an abstract concept, but as an embodied experience. To answer, we need to resort not only to science or philosophy, but also to the strength of symbols because they give body to the invisible. An ancient narrative speaks of a traveler who walked toward the desert in search of answers. For days, the horizon did not change, only dunes repeated by the wind. Exhausted, he believed the path was useless, until he noticed something unusual. Every time he fixed his attention on a distant point, the dunes seemed to reorganize to form a trail in that direction. It was not the desert that offered passage, but the gaze that opened the way. The landscape was not static. It was sensitive to the traveler's focus. This story reveals what we so often forget. The real bends to consciousness. The traveler did not find a ready-made route. He wove it by choosing where to look. Likewise, in our lives, what we call destiny may be less a pre-designed road and more the desert responding to our focus. And there is another powerful archetype, the archer. He raises the bow, but the arrow only gains meaning when the target is chosen. Before that, it is just wood and string. Consciousness functions as that invisible target. It is what gives direction to energy. Without focus, the arrow is lost in the air. With focus, even the wind seems to help along the way. Life is that bow, always charged with potency, but without destination until the observer sustains his gaze. These narratives move us because they translate into images what we dimly feel. The certainty that we are not merely passing through settings, but that the settings respond to the way we look at them. That is why on days of despondency, the whole world seems hostile, and on days of clarity, the same world appears luminous. It is not the landscape that changed. It is the archer within us who chose another target. This perception also appears in creation myths. Many ancient peoples told that the universe arose from a song, a breath, or a divine gaze. The cosmos did not begin with solid matter, but with a gesture of consciousness that gave form to the void. This myth is not merely cosmogony, it is a reflection of human experience. Every time we look at something with presence, we repeat on a small scale the primordial act of creation. But there is an essential detail. The power of the gaze does not guarantee only beauty. It can also generate labyrinths. The traveler in the desert could have fixed his eyes on the darkness, and in that case, the dunes would organize themselves into walls. The archer may aim at targets of fear, and his arrow will follow in that direction. This shows that consciousness does not discriminate. It merely responds. What we choose to sustain is what becomes real. And it is precisely for this reason that recognizing this power brings not only enchantment, but also responsibility. If we look at life always expecting the worst, the scenery organizes itself to give us proof of this pessimism. If we look at each encounter with openness, the world returns signs of reciprocity. It is as if reality were a liquid mirror. It returns not only the form, but also the intention we carry. The big question then is not only what is the real, but What do I choose to sustain with my gaze? This is the point where science, myth, and everyday life meet. It is not about denying difficulties or pretending that suffering does not exist. It is about understanding that even suffering reorganizes itself before the consciousness that observes it. It can become prison or portal, depending on the gaze that sustains it. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of the archetype of the observer, discovering that we are never merely facing facts. We are always facing choices of focus. At every moment, consciousness can point the arrow toward fear or creation, toward prison, or toward the desert that opens into a trail. This understanding does not end the mystery. On the contrary, it deepens it. Because in realizing that reality is alive and malleable, the observer stops seeking fixed answers and begins to sustain questions that keep him awake. And in this state of wakefulness, the entire world ceases to be scenery and becomes dialogue. If the archetype of the observer shows us that the gaze reorganizes the real, the next step is to bring this perception into the body, into direct experience. Because it is not enough to understand intellectually, it is necessary to feel the vibration of this force in the very act of being alive. Close your eyes for a few moments and notice the breath moving within you. Do not force the air, simply allow it to go and return. Now, visualize before you an open, wide, boundless space. In this space, each breath of yours is like a wave that expands. The more you sustain your focus, the more you perceive that the space responds, as if it were water vibrating at the contact of your presence. This practice is not just imagination, but a training of attention. It shows that consciousness is not a weak flashlight that illuminates isolated pieces of the world, but a silent sun capable of warming the entire field. The more you keep the inner gaze steady on this space, the more you feel it molding itself to your state. The space is not neutral, it is sensitive to your vibration. Now direct this exercise toward a concrete situation in your life. Bring to mind something that seems blocked or confused. Instead of trying to solve it or force answers, sustain your inner gaze upon this situation as one who observes a landscape from afar. It is not about denying the problem, but about realizing that, by sustaining it with presence, it begins to reorganize. As if the simple act of looking were already a creative movement. This technique reveals a simple and powerful truth. Consciousness does not need to act with violence to transform. It moves like water that, upon touching stone, slowly shapes it. The steady gaze opens invisible paths that haste never finds. Another possible exercise is to use the body as a laboratory of the observer. Choose a physical part. It may be the hands, the chest, or the face. Direct your full attention to that region and keep it there for a few minutes. Little by little, you will notice warmth, vibration, or subtle movements you did not notice before. This practice shows that even the body responds to the gaze. Wherever you sustain focus, energy is reorganizing. Where focus does not reach, the body remains dormant. This experience can expand beyond you. Try fixing your inner gaze on someone you love, even if that person is not physically present. Notice how the energy shifts, as if the space between you were activated. This connection does not depend on distance, because the gaze of consciousness is not limited by the physical eyes. It acts like a field, crosses walls, unites distant hearts. This kind of practice was preserved by ancient traditions of contemplation, prayer, and meditation. All, in different ways, affirm the same. Sustaining the inner gaze is a creative gesture. No matter the name given, the principle is one. The universe reorganizes itself according to the quality of the attention that touches it. The challenge lies in consistency. Our mind is trained to scatter, to jump from one image to another. But each time we manage to return to focus, it is as if a new thread were woven into the invisible fabric of reality. The field does not change through theories, but through the repeated exercise of the gaze. And here a crucial point arises. It is not necessary to believe blindly for it to work. The simple act of practicing already reveals little by little the response. Whoever sustains attention perceives subtle transformations that, when accumulated, become concrete changes. The real responds, and this response confirms the power of the observer. Take this into your daily life. Before a difficult conversation, Sustain for a few seconds the inner gaze upon the space that surrounds the two of you. Before starting a task, be still and perceive the energy of the environment, like one who prepares a fertile field before planting. In each gesture, you will be training consciousness to act as a creative source. The practice is not complicated. The hard part is remembering to do it. But each time you remember, even for a brief instant, you already inscribe a new vibration into the world. The universe does not demand excessive effort, but true presence. And that presence is enough to move invisible mountains. The real then ceases to be something fixed and becomes a field in constant dialogue with you. The technique is not a trick, but a reminder. You were never merely before life. You have always been part of it, writing invisible lines with the simple act of looking. Notice, each exercise was not merely mental training, but a reminder that reality was never ready, waiting for you. It has always been molding itself in response to your gaze, like water that takes the shape of the vessel where it rests. Consciousness is not just another detail in the equation of life, it is the entire equation breathing through you. Perhaps this explains why some encounters change the course of our story without warning, or why a simple decision to look within changes everything around. The world is not a distant stage, it is a weave that writes itself to the same beat as your focus. And each conscious breath is like a new word in this open book. Do not conclude hastily. Remain with this vibration. Notice how the space around you already seems different, just because you sustained attention in this video up to this point. The real is not stone, it is river. It moves to the rhythm of the observer. Now I want to invite you to leave a mark from this encounter. If you made it to the end, write in the comments, "I choose to create with my gaze." I want to know that this message resonated in you. And if you felt the strength of this content, subscribe to the channel. There is much more to be discovered, and each new video is another door that opens before your creative consciousness. Do not carry closed answers. Carry questions that glow in the dark. The real is already drawing near.